Okay, so this is definitely not an agile talk. Um, it might feel that way at times, and it's neither a positive or negative critique on it, but we have a lot of people from that space in the room, so you'll probably find some connection there. It's also dedicated to Stephen, because Stephen, who has been here, I think, in every single meetup we've had, coming all the way from Trent, at one of our meetups said, you know what, shut up, Chris, your theory's good, we need to talk some real stories here, like what's actually happening. Stop reading books. So most of this is not from a book. And in fact, it's a bit of a representation of a little glimpse of part of my journey and quite a number of others in this organization, as we've kind of tried to change our company, change the way we work. I tried my best to sort of pause in terms of explain terms, but if I start to use terms that you may not understand, just stop me and ask, and that's sort of why we have a whiteboard over there. I'll just explain it. So I think it's better that we kind of follow this at the same pace together, and I'll stop and I'll explain whatever I mean at any time. So I think that'll be actually a better way of having this discussion. Okay, so 3 parts. Part 1, I want to talk about our organizational journey, and it kind of looks something like this. 2013, we're kind of a company that's, by and large, having a bunch of large projects, relying heavily on, heroics, things that are breaking and people getting together, and boy, are we really good at getting together and fixing things at time of crisis. Manage projects, but inconsistent outcomes. Sometimes our projects are kind of delivered on time, sometimes they're not, sometimes they're on budget, sometimes they're not. Sometimes our customers are happy, sometimes they're not, many times they're not. And so somewhere around there we go in and say, we're going to do some agile transformation, and we're going to introduce Scrum, and all teams are going to be doing Scrum, particularly in technology. And we're no longer be doing projects, we're going to have product streams, and we're going to go and do that. And we're not going to have managers anymore. We are going to have self-organizing teams. So a big change for this company, and who's familiar with the sort of J-curves or Satar curves, right? So most of you, deep and long. Fuck yeah, like it was hard, right? Like this was traumatic, the kind of stuff that you sort of see where there's turnover, there's people that are going through all sorts of trauma, identities are shifting, jobs are changing. But we get through that, it's kind of a couple years, and we're doing Scrum. We're starting to get some really consistent outcomes, right? Things are starting to feel like, this was worth it. There's some other things that we didn't expect to see, sort of the creation of tribes and tribal identities that are around teams. So we used to have that around projects maybe, or departments, but now they're around teams. So a few things that we didn't expect, but there was some upside. But then if you start to sort of zoom back and think of the customer, are we actually getting economic outcomes, right? Are we actually, as a company, performing better if you were going to take the lens of our customers? Not quite there yet, right? So a little bit more consistency of what they expect, but not necessarily consistency in terms of success in the marketplace. So, as we're sort of moving away from 2015 into 2016, we start to say, okay, we really need to think about how we go about pivoting this and thinking less about, how we flow through teams and more about how we flow from a customer-oriented perspective, which is now thinking about, what is a system, getting some measurements, some metrics, visualizing the system, moving from, ultimately if you look at Scrum push system, moving away into maybe a pull system at at a system level, limiting and constraining some of the amount of work that's going through our organization. And so we're kind of in the middle of just doing that. It's, some successes, but the big difference we're seeing is small J-curves, right? Little small things that we're adjusting over time. So as we look at the data that shows up through our metrics, as we run experiments, we say, oh, we didn't realize that. Let's make a tweak, right? And then let's look at what it changes, and is that change common cause variation or special cause variation, and is it actually helping us, and adjusting over time. And the changes are small enough that we're kind of getting at the point where we can absorb them. There's no people freaking out. There's no sort of, holy shit, the whole world is changing. It's more like at the pace that's acceptable for us. But we're getting a little bit closer to the customer and success from their perspective, which was kind of what we were after all along. So, recently we've been sort of thinking about, our organizational maturity, and there is this model that the guys out of the Lean Kanban University have been working based on some stuff from Jerry Weinberg and some new developments out of CMMI. And, they're saying, well, if you think about maturity from the lens of an organization that can survive, what does that look like? So a lot of organizations start to think about things in the here and now. So, how are we going to make profit this quarter, or how are we going to make profit this year? But there's another agenda that you think about from a position of survivability, right? And survivability, there's an aspect of that is about taking change that happens in your marketplace and saying, cool, opportunity there. Let's do something with that. You think about companies like Amazon, where they're trying a whole bunch of different stuff. Some of them are actually pretty crummy failures, but they're trying enough things that their system is actually quite resilient. So, how many people have sort of encountered anti-fragile Teleb stuff? A few people, right? So for those that don't, just a quick sort of catch up on that. So we all know what fragile is, right? You take a glass cup and you drop it on the ground and it shatters, right? So what's anti-fragile? And most people will sort of respond saying it's something that's resilient or robust, something that you drop and it won't break. But actually that's kind of a in-between state. The opposite of fragile is something that gets better with stress, right? So you drop something and it's better, right? So take something like milk, add time to it, it gets sour, pretty fragile. Take something like wine, no. Add a few years, might be quite nice. So how do we make organizations like that? And that's kind of the ladder of maturity you think about, right? So you don't kind of get there because you're lucky or you have a bunch of smart people, but you have the systems in place to be able to respond and adapt to change. There's sensing, there's happening, and there's a way you're organizing that says, you know what, the way we are good is not about the one product that we have, but in our ability to change. And that's kind of that maturity ladder that we've been looking at. So that's kind of end of part one, to say, we're not sure, where we would be honestly self-evaluating, but, if we think about where we came from, if you looked at that if you remember that slide before, we were kind of in this chaotic, emerging space, moved up, some consistency in outcomes in Scrum, but, we're trying to get here, right? Particularly for our company, lots of change in the marketplace. We actually don't know where it's going to be. So getting good at that is not about having a specific product, but being able to actually have various products that we can actually respond to the marketplace. So certainly something that's important for us. Okay, so that's the backdrop. Part two, let's talk about our journey to find out a little bit more about our systems. So we do a lot of metrics here, And one of them that we use quite extensively is the cumulative flow diagram, or the CFD. And so I'm going to spend a really quick moment explaining what that is. And then I'm going to use that to sort of show some things that were happening in our organization. So CFD, basically you have this two-dimensional graph here. On the x-axis, time. On the y-axis, work items. And so you start to plot at its most basic form the difference between work arriving, like demand, and work being completed. So it's day one, two things show up. Your customer's arriving and says, I need 2 widgets, or whatever it is they're asking for. Day two, another customer shows up, they ask for 1 more. Next day, nothing. On day 4, they ask for 2 more things. On day 6, they ask for 1 more item. At day 8, yet another thing. On day 2, the item that they asked for on day 1, you got it done. Day 3, you got 1 more thing done. Didn't get anything done on day 4 or 5. Day 6, you got 1 more done. Day 8, a couple more. So you draw these lines. So this is basically your demand line, and this is your delivery line. Okay? And that's why it's called cumulative, because you're just constantly adding to it. And there's a few things that are kind of really quick aspects of your system. So the distance between these 2 lines is the average amount of time that your customer is waiting. Right? So I asked for something then, I get it now. On average, that's how long I wait. And this is actually the amount of work that's sitting in inventory. The stuff that has been asked for that isn't done yet. So it's somewhere in your process. You know, if you think about it in a sort of a material form, it's like in the warehouse, either maybe before it's been on the loading dock or somewhere in the process, but somewhere in inventory. And so this is something that you can really easily do, but it tells you a lot about your system. So we've been doing a lot of these, and we have various programs and various different areas. And so, you know, after a while, we kind of looked at some data and I was like, holy shit, this looks kind of weird. What's going on here? And I had a meeting, and we had this, a variant of this in front of a bunch of senior folks in our company, and I said, you know, we had a bunch of initiatives, and I said, well, here's the CFD for an initiative. It's got a range of about 5 to 7 months. It's got this kind of shape here and shape here. Is it this program, which is maybe about 60 or 70 people, this one, another 60 or 70 people, this one, another 40 or so people, this one, another 50 or 60 people, or is it just this pea pod here, or is it all the above? And the answer, what do you think the answer was? Who thinks it was one of the A through D's? Who thinks it was the all of the above? Yeah, it was all of the above, right? And so think about this, and I'm sure everyone has heard different variations of, hey, you know, you can't really use data because, you know, the work is different, or the capabilities of the teams are different, or, you know, the specifics of this particular area of the business is different, or we're unique. These were all very different programs with different people, different technologies, different customers, and yet they all delivered in the exact same way. The commonality was their system was set up in the same way across all of them. And so we're like, oh, yeah, this is a good shorthand. We have a bunch of Peapod delivery teams. That's what the system is cranking out. And so, you know, part of us is, okay, so is this something that we can accept? Is this just kind of like fact of life? Every software development team just kind of coalesces into this pea pod that's somewhere between 5 to 7 months. If that's true, we have a problem, because 5 to 7 months is not fit for purpose for our organization. It's not going to be successful for us, because our market moves faster than 5 to 7 months. So we're always going to be in this position of responding to the market after the market has already moved, which creates a lot of risk for us. So hopefully it's not true. And there's a lot of talk about the introduction of stability, and stability being the goal, and having stable velocity or stable this and that. That's pretty effing stable, right? This is as stable as it gets. It's shit though, but it's stable, right? So so we're like, okay, we gotta do something about this P-pod stability. Let's look at some common aspects of the system that we need to understand. And so there are some stuff that's going on here that some of our outcomes or some are contributors to this. But so we know, based on just how CFDs are defined, anyone asking for something here is waiting a long time, right? If you ask for something here, not so long, but here, long time. We have some issues around demand showing up unconstrained. So, this is kind of a batch of various items that are being delivered. There is kind of a cyclical relationship to the passage of time. And so realizing that time allows for this P-pod shape, because the more time you have, the more opportunity you have for revealing scope and variability that's been driven out of that scope. So the idea here is that as we're going and drilling through our work, the longer it takes, the more information we uncover, the more information we uncover, the more change in scope is driving out. It's kind of this relationship there. And why do we actually do these long batches? And so part of it was realizing we actually have some very high transaction costs. I don't have time to go over transaction costs. This diagram alone is probably a good hour-long conversation, so maybe that's a great possibility for another meetup. But it's causing these causal loops for us, where transaction costs creating these longer batch cycles, introducing more variability, the variability introducing more scope, P-pod shape, 5 to 7 months. The other problem is we are, in many cases, in our development end, using Scrum, and we do it quite well. We deliver our sprint goals every 2 weeks. There are teams that will make a commitment, and they've gotten really good at meeting those commitments. And yet, it's not exploitable by the organization. We can't do anything with it. So part of that is understanding what's part of the underlying system that's preventing this from being unlocked for us. Now, we also looked at the operational side of things, and this is kind of a story of soup kitchens and country clubs. And, really a good illustration of the effects of overburdening. So again, using a CFD, it's not the only metric we use, but it's a very revealing one. And so here's 2 services that we offer, and one of them is kind of like a country club. People come in, they get their stuff done, they don't have to work a lot of overtime, a lot of delighted customers, the weather's good, there's some good golf, that sort of thing. The other one, holy shit, I would hate to work there. It's like Depression era soup kitchen. Lineups along the block, nobody's happy, long work hours, and what's going on. And so, we looked at the characteristics of the differences between these two. One had a set of policies on restricting their demand, the other one had unrestricted demand. And so the differences between the two, well, one was we let everyone in the door, and so we try our best, And so our work in process grows, and that starts to create everything slower, and that slower makes more of the stuff grow, and so on and so on. They actually, you're probably curious why they kind of started to got better. They got to a point that a whole bunch of demand expired. So basically kind of an idea of it was so late that we just had to give up on it, right? These are kind of clues that we started to look at from a system perspective, saying, hey, you know, there are some things that are helping our system because, you know, other than the fact that one was constrained, the other one was not, generally same amount of overall demand. So there's something going on from a system perspective. Bit of a pause. Any questions or comments on sort of the topics kind of with me so far?
Will you go into defining what constrains your demand?
Yeah, there's a little bit on that. Please take the dice.
Try every 20. Does it work?
You gotta really like.
Do it.
You gotta kiss that thing.
It's getting more awkward as the time passes. So, with those two services, Jeff's my hero. I was going to say something that would be totally inappropriate. Is there something underlying the difference between those services? Did they evolve differently? Was the imposition of restricted demand something that was done consciously, or did this just happen?
Very good question. Actually, the differences were unconscious, right? So it's not like, you know, one of the teams that went on some training and they realized, hey, you know, here's a lever that we can pull. They just realized, hey, you know what, we seem to be doing a lot of stuff, and some of this stuff is kind of a joke. So let's push back on some of that stuff. So they had not necessarily rigid processes on restricting demand, but they had some mechanism to do so, whereas the other one did not have at all.
So I have a question here. I'm going to assume that these two charts are over the same time, and I realize that they're a metaphor and to be examples, but I'm a manager and I want my teams to deliver. And when you restrict my service there, you're delivering 140 story points or whatever the heck it is in the restricted service, yet you're delivering 480 in the unrestricted. I'm gonna pick the unrestricted because you're delivering more stuff for me over the same time period.
All right. Well, good luck with that bankruptcy. But so yeah.
Tell me why that's going to give me bankruptcy. I'm getting more value out to my customers.
It's a really good question, Jeff. Right, and it's one that I would suspect that most people who talk to executive or managers would probably get. So thanks for bringing it up. So there is a difference, and part of it is about waiting and expectations, right? If I am a customer of this service, I can expect two things. I don't know when I'm going to get my stuff, but it's probably going to be a long wait, right? So in a macro sense, yeah, there's a lot of throughput going on, but the individual services are not arriving in time. So there could be a lot of things moving through the system, but from an economics perspective, a lot of things arriving way too late to be leverageable, right? So we're not making money. Even though there's a lot of movement through the system, we're not making money, right? The difference here is, I know how long it's going to take. It's quite stable, and it's fairly short. So so think about it from the perspective of you have a business and there's various options you can deliver on things. They're not equally weighted, right? They have different profiles on what's going to make the business successful and what's not. So imagine the thing that's going to make the business successful is stuck somewhere here, right? You're going to be kind of, you know, pissed off, right, as an organization. So as a manager, it's like, you got to ask yourself the question, do I want a service where if I've identified the right things to be delivered by the organization, they're going to get done, and I can count on that being done. I can't count on that here. So that would be my answer, Jeff. that helping you with your meeting next week with your managers, or? Okay, so Geraldine, yeah.
I just want to ask one more question. So when you count that, do you count everything that's been asked or the stuff that's been decided to actually be done?
Where's your commitment point, right?
So that's an excellent point, because when we say unrestricted demand, it basically means I'm going to do everything I'm asked of, right? There is no logic, right? Maybe there's a first in first out system going on. Maybe there is some sort of ROI basis in terms of we do these first, next. But at the end of the day, we're just going to commit to doing everything. Whereas, and I'm not going to get into in-depth Kanban, but if you look at that space, they introduce things like commitment points, where we say, okay, so once it's past a certain spot, that's when we start measuring we've committed to customer, and so demand that has been committed to is when we start measuring lead time. But from that perspective, it's just whatever shows up. So, we're good to move on? Okay. So, we're looking at this overburdening problem, and just to recap, I'm sure most people in the room are familiar with Little's Law, but it's kind of Little's Law in action, right? So if you think about this metaphor of this road, I think this is a road in Thailand, but these cars are trying to get from the start of the street to the end of the street. So probably have a longer journey, but let's just stick with just that one spot. And so you have your available throughput, the road capacity itself, you have the work in process, and you have the lead time, right? So if there's one car on this road, it's kind of obvious, right? It's going to zip down. The lead time, which is the time it takes to get from here to here, is going to be fast. 2 cars, probably fast. 3 cars, probably fast. This amount of cars, slow. And so going back to Jeff's question, yeah, you're moving a whole bunch of stuff, but it's gridlock. So if the thing that is going to save your company is sitting here, you're stuck. It's not moving. So that's the problem of overburdening and allowing that to happen. So for those who need the equation, lead time, work in process, divide by throughput. It's a very simple equation. But that is starting to understand why overburdening of systems becomes a huge business disadvantage, because it doesn't allow you to pivot when you need to pivot. It doesn't now allow you to respond at the speed you would prefer to respond, because there's all these cars stuck in the road. Now, we can talk about things like class of service and other stuff later on, where smart municipalities put like lanes here for ambulances so they can go fast, things like that, HOV lanes and so on. But at the end of the day, if this is all you got, good luck moving your important stuff through. So this is kind of what we were seeing with a lot of our systems. And then we started to look at other things, which was flow efficiency. And so if you think about what this formula is, it's basically, how much of the work is actually being done over the period of time that the customer waits. And, if you look at the actual industry numbers, without seeing the bottom thing here, you'd be shocked, right? 40% is considered to be phenomenally good and very rare, right? And so a 2% or less is actually quite common, and frequently you see less than 15%. So think about this. If less than 15% of your time is working, and so in this context, software development, could be anything. If less than 15% of your time is that, if you try to make that faster, how much effect are you actually having on the system? Not that much, right? So, say it was 10%, and you double throughput on that, so what? You still have the other 80% to deal with. And so dealing with the gaps in the interactions in the system became a bit of a challenge. By the way, I'm not going to reveal company secrets, but we ain't 40%. We're somewhere in this range. And I suspect most of you guys, if you are working for software in this company that's at a certain scale, it's probably in that range too. Especially if you're not looking at it and not managing it. If it's unmanaged, and it's complex, you're here. If you want to take a bet on it later on, I don't know how much money I have, but I'll bet something. I'll guarantee you're in that range. It's a good bet. Sorry, you're not in that range.
No, not that. Curious, how did you calculate the touch time or the times you're actually doing value-add work?
Well, it's so I think calculating touch time is a little bit of a challenging act. So I don't think you need to be going into that level of detail. All you really need to, so if you're having like a Jira system or any other system, you just go in and you look at very easy data points to look at. Okay, when was it created? When was this feature created? When was it delivered? And then you look at check-ins and when the stages moved, and you realize, hey, a lot of that has been in wait states. So even at that course, the challenge here is not to find out whether you're 3% or 4%. The challenge here is to say, am I in this range or in this range? So I wouldn't, like if you want to go back to your organization and try and calculate it, don't try and boil the ocean in terms of getting the exact number and find, like, for God's sakes, don't introduce some sort of time tracking system where your developers are like, logging the time they write in code. Just sort of do a ballpark figure on it. That'll give you a sense of what range you're in. Okay. And part of this also is, if you think about these blue shades, there's probably slices of red in them as well, right? So it's not that precise. So, we're armed with this and say, okay, so there's a bit of a flow challenge, and we looked at one of our services a little bit more, and we said, okay, so what's going on here? And we started to try and unravel this kind of big ball of yarn. So it's interesting what you start to do with artificial constructs of how you design delivery systems, especially ones that have just sort of organically evolved over time. But if you think about this particular customers, they're only asking for 4 simple things. Resolve system availability, maintain your applications, I need some information, make some changes. Kind of like, hey, if it's broken, make it go again. Change my oil. How does this work? I think this would be nice to be different, right? These 4 things. And so you start to say, okay, well, how does that sort of, manifest just, and by the way, this diagram is just from the demand side. It's not even from the delivery side, just demand. So just from demand, you find there's n-by-n route combinations. There's multiple work specializations. So not only is it dependent on the type of work, but who asks for it, where it routes. It ends up going into a lot of queues, almost all of them unconstrained. And almost always the work is pushed. So the push means that the delivery end has no control over the amount of buildup that's happening in the queues. So that was kind of an aspect of our system. So, this is not sort of like the solution, but it was kind of like, kind of maybe a Columbo, Batman sort of Sherlock Holmesian, let's assemble clues, figure out what's going on. So that was sort of enough for us to say, okay, we have some issues. We have to think about flow and routing. We need to think about overburdening. In some cases, work starvation. Is that a rating?
No.
Oh.
Hold on, I do have the rating here.
You're mean. So that was kind of the evidence side of things. And so, the last part is, okay, so let's do something about it, right? That was all good information, but what are we going to do about it? And so who are our prime suspects in this, mystery that's unfolding, right? And, 3 things are sort of coming up to the forefront for us. Variability, flow, and demand versus capacity balance. Those are the things that are in our way. If we can solve that and figure out a way to manage those things, and by the way, solving it is not about sort of, here's the final solution, but a way of managing it with the organization, this will make a big difference. So I'm going to go into variability in a moment. I'm going to go into flow and demand capacity as well. So for us, you know, we are suffering still from a lot of plans. They're like, we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, and then gold at the end. And, you know, our problem was, you know, life and systems don't really work out that way. We have really 3 big sources of variability that we were able to identify. So a divergent market, so the market that we served, changing all the time. Emergent information discovery, so, you know, as we go about going through the act of delivering, we discover a bunch of information that we didn't know. And their ability to predetermine the level of complexity of actually delivering a solution is only revealed through the process of delivering it. So we can try and say, let's get better at fortune telling, or let's get better at accepting that these are 3 things that are part of our reality and figuring out a way to actually deal with them. So, you know, some of the things, tricks along the way, I'm not going to go into details about this process, but roadmaps and project plans and, you know, portfolio plans, deterministic. We're not going to do those. So going more into a improvement kata perspective. Yes, we can have goals. For sure, goals are important. In fact, goals are necessary. But we're going to think about the big goals, and we're going to think about the smaller ones. And then we're going to go and figure out how to get to the smaller one first. And usually that involves some form of experimentation. And through experiments, that also means experiments that don't necessarily yield the results that you suspected. You go in, you do this. Eventually, you might reach your target condition. You introduce some form of cadence of inspection. If you get to your target condition, that now becomes your current condition. You set a new target condition. You get your way towards your goal. Don't come up with these big plans, because by 11 a.m. the next day, they're obsolete. We're spending a lot of time on these things. And a lot of our time is spent and energy trying to get reality back to fitting the plan, rather than just accepting new information, leveraging it, and exploiting it. To do that, we need to be thinking small. So, you know, this is just for completeness sake, but, you know, going into the model of delivering smaller bites, but things that are of value, so that we can exploit market information and actually get market benefits. So, you know, I stole this from Spotify because they probably had to. Actually, if I had to redo this, I would probably make this car shittier somewhat if I were to like redo this. But anyway, shorthand for you know what I'm talking about. We also start to think about, and I think this was the most important shift for us, is thinking about the way we deliver from a customer-oriented perspective. So I use the word value streams. I'm not sure I like that term too much, because you Google this and you get a lot of manufacturing stuff, different domain, not necessarily the right thing for software. So, you know, I'm not sure value streams is the right word for it. Maybe workflow. And so it's you know, debatable what term we use, but the big thing here is trying to understand the world in terms of your customers. So we start to think about, how do we organize all of the work we do in our company across value streams? How would that look like? And it starts to introduce a very different way of thinking. So if you think about most organizations, they got functions. I'm accounting, I need to sort of think about, you know, making money. I'm HR, I'm thinking about the people. I'm marketing, I'm trying to get marketing stuff done. IT, delivering software, maintaining it, that sort of thing. But none of that really is a goal on its end. It's just an artificial construct of how an organization has decided to organize itself. Really, at the end of the day, is you have customers, they need stuff. Those are the things that are important. And your customers have various purposes, so you have to understand what those purposes are. So, value streams, if you're going to think about that, the endpoints always need to be customers. I have some need, I got it. And then realizing that some of these things flow simply through the organization, and some of them flow through more complexity. The simple stuff, well, not that big of a challenge. The complex stuff, quite a bit of a challenge. In fact, it starts to get kind of exponentially more difficult the more complex it becomes. So, the cool thing is, and we've been spending a lot of time in the Kanban space, is if you can go in and look at these value streams and express them in terms of services, you can optimize them. And we've been using a lot of their techniques to do just that. And I'm not going to go into static, and I think that this might be an opportunity for later on and maybe an exercise. But when I throw this up, you can have this deck to refer to. But these are kind of like the basic steps of static. When we think about service delivery, you find out a lot about the information, mostly from a customer expectation point of view. You try and match that in terms of how you're actually delivering work, and start there to seek forms of optimization. So I'm not going to go into static, but certainly if we're hanging around, I'll talk about it if you want to go into a little bit more detail. But the acronym, by the way, stands for Systems Thinking Approach to Introducing Kanban. Right? So it's just a way of applying some systems thinking to your world before you go and introduce Kanban. Kind of nice at a team Kanban level, beautiful at an organizational level, at the level of services, at the level of enterprise services. This is where the magic for this really happens. Not so much at the sort of lower level. It's still very effective there, but if you get a bunch of people with C in front of their name or VP of some sort, and you take them through something like Kanban, they start to see the world in terms of services. All of a sudden, they're oriented in a way that actually can change things. Jeff, how are we doing for time?
You got about 1 minute.
Okay, I have like 7 slides. I've cut the appendix out. 7 slides. More or stop? 10 seconds each? How much more? Like 10 more minutes? 10 minutes? All right. In Vanna, could you reset the clock? So let's look at flow from the perspective of what we've been doing. And this is kind of how, if you remember the first slide, that in the middle section where we had introduced Scrum, and for a couple of years it was working well. So the model is kind of like this. We got a bunch of ideas being sensed from the customers. They devolve into features. Those features get dissected in stories, and they get routed to various Scrum or Kanban teams depending on the flavor on the local side. They move into some form of queue where the stories accumulate, and eventually sufficient accumulation has occurred that we can deliver something to the customer. So kind of another way of expressing the P-pod that we talked about. The P-pod arc is that accumulation of stories that's been taking place through these teams. So that's kind of was our existing world, and sort of to a large degree is still in various areas. So what's going on here? So part of that is we're having a lot of early commitment with connecting without any connection to capability. So customers are being said, hey, we're going to give this to you. Hey, we're working on some other stuff, but okay, sure. Why not? So that shows up eventually as it moves forward from kind of ideas to features to some form of unconstrained demand. Hey, we promised the marketplace, if you don't do it, we're screwed, so you better do it. And then by the time it gets to this side, kind of the downstream of this flow, it's not very recognizable. And when I say recognizable, I mean recognizable from a customer's point of view. Things have been sliced and dissected, so if you remember the routing, the big routing diagram I showed earlier, by the time it's been routed, these guys, if these guys were to give them some sort of update on what they're working on, they have no idea what they're doing. It's so disconnected. So, is that a problem? Well, kind of, because, if you think about things like both local Kanban and Scrum, they're all about continuous improvement, and their improvement is in terms of a local context. They're not necessarily oriented in terms of improvement on the customer context. So that disconnect is creating a bit of a vacuum that's not necessarily giving the right information for teams to orient their improvements effectively. And so the next thing, and we saw clues with this with the flow efficiency metric, was the white spaces between teams are sources of the greatest delays. So, these are complex systems. There is no one team big enough or cross-functional enough to deliver these capabilities. So collaboration does happen. And that collaboration causes delays. The collaboration is not managed. It's the greatest source of delay. So this adds tons of complexity to delivery. And we looked at this and we asked ourselves really hard, are we actually managing that? No, we're not. We're not. We might ask Scrum Masters and product owners and team members to collaborate more, and maybe they are on the fringes, but certainly they're not. If this is connected to this and connected to that, these guys are not talking. So you can't really have a committee solve this problem for you. You have to have managed systems. So current look is to evolve into something that looks more like this. There is no promise. There's a sense. And the idea here is to get from ideas to features that are good, to features that will do, to features that will do next. And this is where they sit and wait and they're constrained. I showed one here. It could be 20, it could be 1, but the idea here is that it's constrained. And this sits here until this capability on the delivery end essentially is aware of its capabilities and can actually send signals to say, hey, you know what, we have capacity, let's pull in more work. So if you think about how this starts to express in terms of ensuring we don't have overburdening, it means that our customers are now going to have reliable expectations, right? The system is going to have some amount of capability. Every time it's done its work, it's going to pull in more work, and if managed properly, it's going to reduce a significant amount of variability in its delivery. You're not waiting all sorts of different times. So work is pulled in. The other thing here is, the idea is that delivery improvements are, so first of all, the improvements of the teams that are within this side of the equation, now they're oriented towards the customer's perspective. They're not thinking about how do I get better at this particular system, or application I should say, but what is the service that's being required and how do I actually change the way we work to improve the delivery of that service. They're also going to be able to express, the system itself is going to be able to express progress in terms that the customer can recognize. If you think about the previous page about, working on enough stories until there's sufficient critical mass to release something, this is not about just waiting for that magic moment that we can't predict, but saying, hey, the thing you asked for, it's at this stage, there's a viability within product, this is how we can show it to you, coalesced from, who cares whether it's 20 teams or 1, but the various stages are aligned to a customer's oriented perspective. So a lot of that in the background is about introducing Kanban systems, but I'm not going to get into that. And also realizing that it's kind of messy. Teams are all over the place. So you have various value streams, and you're not going to have sufficient cross-functionality within one team to pull it off. There are economic limits to doing that. You can't just go in and just say, I'm going to have, UX capabilities across 100 teams, right? You just can't do that. So where it makes sense, you're going to have dedicated cross-functional teams, if you can. Where it makes sense, you might have some form of shared service, you might have SWAT teams, you might have squads. It doesn't really matter. That is going to have to evolve. But the idea here is that you're looking at your system, you're getting all the right information to evolve it, you make those changes as required. So it will get messy, it will continue to get messy, but the upside is the messiness is aligned to customer value rather than just some arbitrary flow. Your organization is also going to need to be able to make different bets. So if you think about value streams from the perspective of the analogy of something like Starbucks, a value stream is something like, say, Frappuccinos, right? You're not going to just one day not have Frappuccinos, and the next day you will. It's fairly static. It's a big deal to remove that product line. So what as a company you need to do is you need to think about, okay, so it's summer, we're gonna up that. It's winter, less so, but the value streams don't go away. They can change, but it's a big change for the organization. So it's not about value streams being expressed as projects. It's about what business we're in. What are our service offerings as an organization? So those become very static, but as you kind of look at sort of the way I've sort of drawn the difference in sizes here, they're going to have different allocations attached to them based on what's important for the organization at a given time. And you'll need to have some way of being able to change those allocations fairly quickly because market conditions can change fairly quickly. So sort of shorthand on some of the big things that we're using as levers: queue management, shared queues, dedicated queues, constrained, unconstrained, FIFO, and all sorts of other variants. Service fidelity, I can go in that in a little bit more detail. Liquidity, the ability to go in and change resources around to different types of demand. So kind of hard to do. If you think about businesses, they think of technical resources as fairly interchangeable, perhaps commodities, but there's a lot of specialization. So that creates a bit of a liquidity crunch. How do I take a bunch of ETL developers and make them iOS app developers? The transition point may be quite difficult, right? So the challenge of making that shift is expressed in liquidity or the lack thereof. Because I can't just shift one type of capability and turn into some other kind of capability. Post systems we talked about, active management of systems we talked about, and then policies are kind of the bread and butter of how this works. You don't go in and sort of, for those of us who have been to the Red Bead experiment, you don't go create motivational posters and you send people to various places and tell them what to do. You establish policies, you determine what's right and what's wrong, you set work and process limits, you determine what gets pulled, you develop replenishment cadences. It's all policy driven. So that becomes a big part of how you go about essentially managing a system. Kind of talking about my point around cross-functional associates teams, high liquidity, high business investment. Can't do it all. Gets too fucking expensive. Service fidelity, we respond to this in terms of class of service. So I'll leave this with you in terms of, you might have this talk with people back home and you might get the, yeah, this is great. You gonna pull stuff? Oh yeah, I know what that means. No due dates, right? Actually, due dates are important. If you can't handle due dates as an organization, you will eventually get screwed. Most organizations of some amount of complexity. The thing you need to understand is you need to go think about how you respond to things differently based on their risk profile, right? And so if you have something that is fixed date, which is kind of build the stadium on time for Olympics, that's got a risk profile that looks like this. I don't have any kind of market benefit until the date, and then if I miss the date, I got nothing, right? Whereas other things that are maybe expedite, hey, it's a big problem now, and it continues to be a big problem. So I can't go around and run a business where I treat everything like this, or I treat everything like this. Most of the stuff you work is actually like this, kind of a puttering impact of delay. So, you treat these as different things, and so, if you're here and your delivery capability is, say, that long, you treat it like that if you're at this point, or you don't start. If you're at this point and your delivery capability is this long, you might have to treat it like that. So understanding where you are based on, the risk profile is important. And that allows you to manage your scarce resources in a much more efficient way. I'll leave you with this, resources, if you want to explore more in terms of what I talked about. So I talked about anti-fragile, some Kanban concepts, particularly static. This is probably my favorite book. I've read it a few times and I keep on learning more every time I read it. So if you want to know about queue management and the actual theory behind a lot of this will explain it to you or confuse you. First time read confused me, second time a little bit less so. Metrics, even more metrics, and then upstream and downstream flow, particularly as it relates to Kanban. These are pretty good resources. Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much for sharing. I can see that you have spent a lot of time visualizing, trying to put together some evidence and constructing a narrative that you can share across the organization. I'm curious to what extent how conversant are your people? How does the conversation, the predominant narrative across the organization had changed from C-level leaders that are able then now to, walk by and just turn around and look at some type of visualization or information radiator, and without asking any question or talking to anyone, just realizing, oh, maybe I could help here, I can see something. But at the same level, I can imagine that your team members, the people that are actually building the solutions and providing the value within all this scaling effort, they get more conversant and more savvy in terms of the overall picture. I'm just interested in how the whole narrative had changed over
It's interesting because I think that the cognitive block to understand this is no different from at least my experience at the team level versus the executive. So, if you start to, and we experience this a lot, part of my story here was introducing some significant system level metrics. And, we had, Scrum Masters asked to participate in this, and product owners and various parts of teams to gather data, and they're like, why do we have to do this? This is wasting my time, and where's this going? And this is just, this is not agile, and a bunch of stuff like that. It took us, if I'm being honest, year and a half to get just that group thinking in these terms. And some of them really in depth, and some of them still kind of on the outskirts. And some of them are in this room today, and I'm probably representative of maybe some of the people who are sort of accelerating and others that are not here, still thinking about it. And then it's the same thing with the executive, right? They need obviously the information, so our ability to go in and show real data to say, okay, it's one thing to say, hey, we need to work together, hey, and if, we work together, it would be much better. But if we go in and profile our flow and show where things are waiting, that's a little bit more compelling evidence. So, I think a lot of it is also to help them get to a point where you don't go as if you're, someone like myself within technology, go to the executive and say, hey, we need to do value streams. They need to come to that conclusion themselves, right? So you provide information, say, hey, this is what it means, blah, 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 and if, upstream we could do this, and connect it all, this is the upside for the organization, and say, maybe we should do maybe one value stream in one area and try it out. And that's kind of, a little bit about where we are at right now, where we're just saying, hey, we want to do that across a whole bunch of different areas. We want to constrain what we're doing. We want to visualize everything. So, who knows how it goes, but we got to start somewhere. Thanks for the question. Chava?
Thanks, Martin. As I was listening to you, and value comes up constantly as you were talking. Can you share us some insights on how you were tracking value, because this is one of the big challenges when I see in big organizations. How do you express value? What's the metric? What's the measurement? Can you give us some insights?
Okay, so I would probably answer that with a plug. Okay, value is something that most people in organizations, except for maybe at the top level, don't understand very well, right? Because in order to understand that, you need to know what business you're in. And in order to know what business you're in, you need to know who your customers are and what purpose drives them. Without that, you're kind of guessing. So I'll make a plug, and maybe we can get him to come here because he's writing a book on it. But Alexei Zeglov and David J. Anderson are working on a book that's in the stages of publishing right now called Fit for Purpose. And that is a fascinating dive into how to actually determine what is valuable for a company or not, because there are a lot of things that if you think of them from an ROI perspective, they seem valuable, but they're not connected to a company's goals, right? And the customers and so on, right? So you can't think of value in terms of just the intrinsic initiative or so on, but connected to more about, what is the purpose of the companies, who customers do they serve, and what are those actual connections. But that book's coming out, but maybe before the book comes out, he can come here and he's somewhat local and maybe do a talk for us. So it's a very good question, a long conversation. Right?
I have a loud voice. I don't know if I need a mic. Thanks. Hey. Whew.
Double
so,
up.
yeah, so my question is, so if we take a look back at your initial diagram, that was kind of like current state, a year and a half ago. I think it started 2012, 2013? 2013?
This one?
So, yes, this diagram, love it. So J-curve number 1, that's really intense, and then J-curve number 2, that's small J-curves. I guess looking at it and hearing the discussion, to me seems like when we were later on in the path forward, we started to think about systems thinking. I'm like, let's rethink the way that we're looking at the problem and come up with something that works better than what we do today. So I guess my question is, if you were to go back in time to 2013, would you start with systems thinking? Or do you think that like the one large J-curve is a stepping stone needed in order to get through the little J-curves?
So I'm not going to mince words. If I could go back and do it again, I would definitely not do it the same way, right? Anyone who's sort of, and I think my CTO would probably go into debate with me on this, and I'm recording it so we can look at it, so we can talk about it later. He's a fan of chaos and big J curves. I think that they put the companies into too much risk. expose too much on the risk side with limiting upside. So if I were to do it again, small J curves, all the way. So start with where you're at. And just think about the improvement kata that we talked about earlier. It's not about, making that big leap, but it's actually about making those small steps. Kind of a tortoise versus the hare, tortoise versus the hare analogy there, where you will outperform the hare that's trying to make a big jump as he falls in a hole and stays there for a while, right? So I think that's a big lesson. I think, Peter, you probably have been exposed to some of that thinking as well. Small J curves all the way. Experiment, iterate your way to change. Thinking about people's identities, their professional identities, being able to hold on to them and leverage them, get the best out of people. That's small J curves. If you can keep them small enough, the trauma becomes kind of in this sweet spot, right? And there's another talk that might be interesting for this crowd, but it's kind of this kind of zone of improvement that is about just enough trauma to sort of get a change going, but not enough to get you to collapse. And that needs to continuously change, but that's what the continuous J curves are all about, to see what's within the zone of capability for the organization. Let's apply a little bit of pressure to get them there. Okay, they've done that. Now they have a new zone of capability, and you go on and you go on. So for sure, no doubt about it. If you do it again, small J curves.
This on? Yeah. Tear to my eye, by the way, on that answer.
Like small J curve brothers there, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. There's the 12-step program argument that you actually have to hit rock bottom before you realize that you can proceed that way. But which is probably more my experience. The question I was going to ask, and I think you've touched upon this in a couple of different ways, but from my perspective, you've kind of changed the boundaries of the system, right? You started off with this very Scrum-centric, it's all about execution and project management, doing it slightly differently, to this world where you've now incorporated the customer, you're now looking at the purpose of the organization. Can you talk a little bit about what that meant for, I would say, what you probably called your product managers in your Scrum days, how that evolved? Because it seems to me that's probably an important part of the story.
We're still in our Scrum days. I mean, I think it's not and I want to be clear on this, it's not about Scrum is not good. It's more of a message of it's just not enough, right? So there is an element of, all the roles necessary to make Scrum successful are there, right? Including, high quality product management. Part of what you recognize is product managers, and this is something that we're still trying to achieve, but if you think about a lot of product manager paradigms, there's a lot of team affinity with product owners, and that needs to change to service affinity or product affinity, right? And I kind of use those interchangeably because my definition of a product is just an encapsulation of a bunch of services. It's just a way that an organization has chosen to give services. They've tried to wrap it around in a product that they can repeat that service around. But ultimately, those product owners need to have affinity on that. So if you think about complex value streams, it takes them in terms of tons of relationships with all sorts of different teams, because that's the expression of delivery of their particular area of value that they're interested in, right? So that becomes a big job, a different job for a lot of product owners. There's also kind of the look at, our product owners at the Scrum level. Product owners are more about closer to business analysts, and that, if we're being honest, maybe it's a little bit closer to that in some situations. Particularly if you look at this model here, where think about this scenario. If a product owner is sitting here supporting Scrum teams, right? Look at the distance between the sense and promise. They're not playing in this area, and so You know, that's really a value of a product owner that needs to be part of the system to say, you know, what are customers asking for, what's important to the marketplace, you know, what is it, where are the scarce resources of this company best suited?
And is that changing in your organization?
It's trying to change is probably a better answer. We probably have a lot of experimentation and some failure along the way before we're at that point.